Hello, everyone, and welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Hal Levinka, and I'm the event director at the bookstore, and I'm absolutely thrilled today to be collaborating again with our friends at NYRB Classics to present a panel on Leonora Carrington, occasioned by their recent reprint of The Hearing Trumpet. Joining us tonight are authors Kathryn Davis, Merve Emre, Chloe Aridjis, and Danielle Dutton. While the pandemic has taken a toll across all of our lives, virtual programs like the one you're about to see have become bright spots in our days. And I want to give a huge thanks to everyone on this panel for taking the time to join us this evening or afternoon or night, wherever you are. So to some housekeeping before we begin. You should be able to see and hear our presenters, but they cannot see or hear you. So if you have any questions, please click on the Q&A button here at the bottom of the screen to submit them. We will try to get through as many of those as we can at the end of the program. There's also a chat button down here where I'm going to be posting links to purchase copies of Carrington's book through Community Bookstore if you so choose. And we hope you would, because they're so fantastic, as you'll find out very soon. A caveat for tonight's event and for all virtual events, we're all at the mercy of our home internet connections and server loads, in this case, across international boundaries. So please bear with any technical issues that might arise. We will try to solve them quickly. And finally, we've scheduled a whole host of spring programming for you. So head over to our website and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date. Next up on our NYRB series on January 28th, we're lucky enough to be hosting the inimitable Dorothy Gallagher for a discussion of her new book, Stories I Forgot to Tell You, in conversation with Susan Minot. Again, this is up on our website now, so head over to register as soon as we wrap up. So now a little bit about tonight's authors, and we will get started. Kathryn Davis is the author of 8 novels, the most recent of which are The Silk Road and Duplex. Her memoir, Aurelia, is forthcoming from Grey Wolf. She has received a Kafka Prize for Fiction by an American Woman, both the Morton Dowen Zabel Award and the Catherine Ann Porter Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and in 2006, the Lannan Foundation Literary Award. She is the senior fiction writer on the faculty of the writing program at Washington University. Merve Emre is Associate Professor of English at the University of Oxford. She's the author and editor of several books, most recently The Annotated Mrs. Dalloway, and a regular contributor to The New Yorker and The New York Review of Books. Chloe Aridjis is the author of 3 novels, Book of Clouds, which won the Prix du Premier Roman Étranger in France, Asunder, set in London's National Gallery, and Sea Monsters, recently awarded the PEN/Faulkner Award for Fiction. Chloe has written for various art journals and was co-curator of the Leonora Carrington exhibition at Tate Liverpool. She starred in Josh Apinanesi's psychodrama Female Human Animal, inspired by the exhibition, and received a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2014. Chloe is a member of XR Writers Rebel, a group of writers who focus addressing the climate emergency and species extinction. A group of her essays and short fiction, Dialogue with a Somnambulist, essays and stories will come out in 2021. And finally, Danielle Dutton's most recent book is the novel Margaret the First. Her writing has also appeared in the Paris Review, the White Review, Guernica, Conjunctions, Harper's, Bomb, etc. She is a professor at Washington University in St. Louis and is co-founder and editor of the feminist press Dorothy, a publishing project, which has published Leonora Carrington. So, panelists, the stage is yours.
Thanks, Hal. And thank you to Community Bookstore so much for hosting us. Like Hal said, I am one of Carrington's publishers. Dorothy put out the complete stories of Leonora Carrington in 2017. And as one of her publishers, I've been asked to act as a kind of unofficial moderator. So that's what I'm going to do. The plan is that we're each going to read a short selection from one of Carrington's works, each for like no more than 5 minutes. And then we'll all talk about those works and across Carrington's works more generally. My guess is that most people here, I don't know why I am guessing this, but know something already or are familiar with Leonora Carrington and her work. But just in case, very briefly, she was English. She grew up in England, and then for a time she lived in France with Max Ernst. She was a painter and writer, a surrealist. She was briefly and terrifyingly interned in a sanatorium for the insane in Spain in, I think, 1940, and then fled to New York City and then moved to Mexico City, where she lived the rest of her life and did her work, very prolific, and raised her family. And I actually thought maybe the liveliest introduction I could give to Carrington would be to read the first paragraph of Merve's recent article on Carrington that appeared in the New Yorker, which is so beautifully written. I love this paragraph. So I'm just going to read this and then we'll get going. So, when asked to describe the circumstances of her birth, the surrealist painter and writer Leonora Carrington liked to tell people that she had not been born, she had been made. One melancholy day, her mother, bloated by chocolate truffles, oyster puree, and cold pheasant, feeling fat and listless and undesirable, had lain on top of a machine. The machine was a marvelous contraption designed to extract hundreds of gallons of semen from animals, pigs, cockerels, stallions, urchins, bats, ducks, and, one can imagine, bring its user to the most spectacular orgasm, turning her whole sad, sick being inside out and upside down. From this communion of human, animal, and machine, Leonora Carrington was conceived. When she emerged on April 6, 1917, England shook. And that was from Extravagant Creatures. So, Merve, I think we'll stick with you right now. I think you're going to read a little bit from the Hearing Trumpet, which is what has gathered us here today, the NYRB Classics reissue of the book. And I thought maybe you could set up what you're going to read, or maybe actually say a little bit about the Hearing Trumpet for anyone who hasn't read it. How would you sum up this book?
How would I sum up this book? So one way to sum it up would be in terms of its sort of very basic plot, which is that a 92-year-old woman named Marian is committed to a retirement home by her family. And there she goes on a grail quest and saves humanity from certain doom. But that, of course, doesn't do the novel justice, and it certainly doesn't do justice to Carrington's incredible humor and her tone. And I hope, oh, the sound is very light. Okay, sorry, can you hear me a little bit better now? Okay. But that doesn't do justice to her extraordinary humor and to her tone, and I hope that that's what you will get a little bit of in the first several paragraphs from the Hearing Trumpet, which I'll read now. It also doesn't do justice to these extraordinary illustrations that Carrington did herself for the book. When Carmela gave me the present of a hearing trumpet, she may have foreseen some of the consequences. Carmela is not what I would call malicious. She just happens to have a curious sense of humor. The trumpet was certainly a fine specimen of its kind, without being really modern. It was, however, exceptionally pretty, being encrusted with silver and mother-of-pearl motifs and grandly curved like a buffalo's horn. The aesthetic presence of this object was not its only quality. The hearing trumpet magnified sound to such a degree that ordinary conversation became quite audible, even to my ears. Here I must say that all my senses are by no means impaired by age. My sight is still excellent, although I use spectacles for reading, when I read, which I practically never do. True, rheumatics have bent my skeleton somewhat. This does not prevent me taking a walk in clement weather and sweeping my room once a week on Thursday, a form of exercise which is both useful and edifying. Here I may add that I consider that I am still a useful member of society, and I believe still capable of being pleasant and amusing when the occasion seems fit. The fact that I have no teeth and never could wear dentures does not in any way discomfort me. I don't have to bite anybody, and there are all sorts of soft, edible foods easy to procure and digestible to the stomach. Mashed vegetables, chocolate and bread dipped in warm water make the base of my simple diet. I never eat meat, as I think it's wrong to deprive animals of their life when they are so difficult to chew anyway.
Thank you. I love that last line. And I couldn't agree more with her. I guess what I wanted to ask you to start with, Merve, was just to talk about the humor in Carrington's work, and maybe particularly in the Hearing Trumpet, which I reread just this past week. And I mean, it's laugh out loud funny. I think one of my favorite laugh out loud lines is police dogs are not, what is it? does anyone remember this? Like, police dogs are not properly speaking animals. And I was like guffawing on the couch. So I wondered if you could talk about the humor, which is sometimes laugh out loud funny, but it's also, it just does a lot more than just be funny somehow in her work. And so, yeah, I just want to see what you think about that.
Well, I actually want to start by tying it back to that opening paragraph that you read, because I think the humor of the paragraph that opens my piece is the humor of that extraordinary combination of the animal, the human, and the machine.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that these three types of creatures or these three types of beings could be allowed to combine and recombine in these utterly fantastic ways. And to me, that's the humor of the Hearing Trumpet, which, you know, is on the one hand described as being like a buffalo's horn, and is sort of comically oversized, right? So when she wears it in that picture I showed you, it seems to actually transform her, to kind of scale her up into something larger than the life she's living or has lived. And at the same time, it's a mechanism, right? It's a kind of like low-tech machine. And I think it's that combination of the animal, the buffalo, the low-tech machine, the low-tech cyborg, and the human that just makes her something so wild and ludicrous. And I think a lot of the humor comes from precisely that, from breaking down the boundaries of what we think of as the human and letting all of these other elements in a way that's responsive and friendly and not at all, well, can be menacing at times, but the humor is precisely what allows you to get over that sense of being something menacing. I mean, also there's just a kind of basic, sort of phallic humor, something like this too, right? So not to be forgotten.
That's so interesting what you say. Chloe and Kathryn, please feel free to just jump in at any time. But what you said about the work always being sort of friendly, even as like menacing things happen or menacing characters appear, but that there is a sort of an overlay or a base layer of friendliness to her work is I had never thought about that word exactly, but that does feel right to me in an interesting way. And I also hadn't thought about it as being connected to the humor, but I like that a lot. I
think that the tone of the humor is very open-hearted and weirdly, unlike much humor, invites you to feel like you are included in whatever it is she thinks is funny, as opposed to poking fun at you. There's nothing particularly aggressive about the tone, and which is unusual given all the things that go on, there are a lot of very aggressive things happening in the book, aggressions, but not in the tone of the voice.
No, and even when the aggressions are happening, the tone is also quite dry, right? So there's this willingness to take whatever is menacing or whatever is aggressive, and on the one hand, kind of minimize it with that dryness of tone, and on the other hand, mine it for what could be friendly, what could be inviting. And I think the humor is always working in those two ways at the same time.
Yeah, that dryness too, what you're talking about makes me think that in a weird way that Carrington's sense of humor might have something to do with what sometimes makes her works feel a bit like a fairy tale to me, which is that that magic is just a sort of accepted, it's just, you accept that these magical things are happening. They're not unusual, but the dryness of the tone, that dry sense of humor is part of what makes everything feel simply acceptable. I'm thinking specifically in a number of the stories, you're just like, you kind of laugh and move along with the absurdity or the surrealness of what's occurring. Yeah, Chloe, I want to give you a chance to jump into if you want, but you don't have to.
I just wanted to say what I think the generosity, and there's a sense of complicity, I think, and that in the storytelling and the voice, and and we sort of travel along with her, and even in her paintings as well, there's a dark humor lurking behind so many of the different situations. And yes, and often laughing in the face of convention or accepted norms. Sometimes more subtly, sometimes, you know, sort of very outright mockery. And
it also feels very English to me.
Definitely.
That
Yeah.
you know, I mean,
I wanted to share, I was just going through my, you know, I'll be reading some of the memories that I structured more, but I came across, I was looking over notes from conversations we'd had when we visited, and there was one that just seemed so appropriate to read, to just bring up today in our discussion, which was an anecdote she once told us when we went to her house. She said her doctor sent her to a German institute to get her hearing checked, but she didn't want to go since she thought it would be full of Germans. She did go, but there were 60 people waiting ahead of her in line, so she left. She said she says she knows she needs a hearing aid because she can no longer hear her cat purr. So that's Leonora summed up of, you know, for her, those years I was still living in Berlin, and she and her husband, they very much, the Europe of their past was still the actual one. And so her husband sometimes says, Berlin still in ruins. And, but for her to not, to just sort of say that, and, you know, well, I didn't go to German Institute because they'd be full of Germans, and just going back to 1938 or whatever.
Yeah, that's wonderful that you say that. And Paul DeAngelis in the chat, which I don't think everyone can see yet or at all, just said, who was her editor and is her estate agent now, just said that he agrees about the friendly and humorous tone, particularly characteristic of post-war writings of the 1950s and later. And he adds she was also like that in person, which I was just going to ask you about, Chloe, if she was funny in person, funny in her speech. And it sounds like, yeah.
As Merve said, it was very dry delivery always. I mean, she had such a sparkle in her eyes, and I'm aware many people, well, a few people watching it knew her too. So I think they'll all agree that there was, yeah, she was always, she'd say things sometimes quite deadpan, but there was always, yeah, mischief behind the facade.
Great. Yeah, I mean, it just seems to me that the humor in her fiction, it seems like a kind of engine, like it's powering something. And I don't feel like I even quite know how to fully articulate this yet, but it feels like anarchic to me, or even erotic. Like, you know, there's a lot of like vaginas and penises in her work, and sort of goddess imagery and stuff. And it feels like somehow in my mind, the humor is connected to that energy. That anarchic spirit. And yeah, I don't feel like I have that. I don't feel like I fully understand it, but I feel that it's like powering the narrative in some way, or powering the world that she's working out of.
I think that's absolutely the case. And it seems like what she's doing also is taking forces that we might think of as erotic. And she, I mean, I'll say more about this later when I talk about the erotic, which I think you're going to ask me about. But anyway, she just always turns everything upside down and inside out. I mean, she gives you something you think you know about, an erotic response, for example, but it's not in its usual form. And so it's just exciting to encounter, as opposed to, you know, blah, 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 penis joke, you know?
Yeah. Wait, can you give it an example? Do you have something in mind that she gives you, but she turns it inside out like an erotic response or something else?
Well, I mean, in a big way, there's the whole end scene toward the end of the Hearing Trumpet, where the narrator gets dropped into a boiling vat, and that whole sense of the heat inside, which is, you know, what Carrington said about her first encounter with Max Ernst. She like went on fire inside. It's like she's dropped into this vat of boiling stew. And yet it is a kind of erotic moment in the book. It's just backwards. Just like then everything in the book is upside down and backwards with the poles and without, you know, giving anything away about what goes on in the book, but it turns out that Lapland goes elsewhere.
Mhm.
One thing to say just might be that like the easiest way to let other people inside, whether physically or spiritually, is to not take your body that seriously, right? To at once feel completely at ease with it as a sort of sensing thing, but also to not feel committed to its shape, to its form, to where it begins and where it ends. And that to me seems like why the erotic, which I think when people say the erotic, we tend to think of it as something like quite serious, right? But it certainly doesn't have to be serious at all. It can be incredibly funny. And the humor of the erotic can be an opportunity to open oneself up. And I think that's what she gets. And that's what that scene where she sort of dissolves demonstrates so beautifully. And I don't think it's an accident that when she dissolves, what she dissolves into are like other women, right? That's the kind of the community that makes that erotic imagination possible.
Yeah, she dissolves, for anyone who hasn't read it, into other sort of goddess figures, and then literally is in a soup, and then she eats herself. I don't feel like these are spoilers. These are just important facts to have. And then, yeah, like her self-cannibalism is like, you're right, Kathryn, it's bizarrely erotic and funny and strange. Actually, Kathryn, would you do your little reading for us now?
Sure.
Hey.
I'm going to read a whole story, but it's short, and I've trimmed it just a tiny little bit so that it won't be more than 5 minutes. So if any of you know this story by heart, you might recognize some sentences are gone from it. This is The Debutante. When I was a debutante, I often went to the zoo. I went so often that I knew the animals better than I knew the girls of my own age. Indeed, it was in order to get away from people that I found myself at the zoo every day. The animal I got to know best was a young hyena. She knew me too. She was very intelligent. My mother was arranging a ball in my honor on the 1st of May. During this time, I was in a state of great distress. I've always detested balls, especially when they are given in my honor. On the morning of the 1st of May, 1934, very early, I went to visit the hyena. What a bloody nuisance, I said to her. I've got to go to my ball tonight. You're very lucky, she said. I'd love to go. I don't know how to dance, but at least I could make small talk. There'll be a great many different things to eat, I told her. And you're complaining? Replied the hyena, disgusted. Just think of me. I eat once a day, and you can't imagine what a heap of bloody rubbish I'm given. I had an audacious idea, and I almost laughed. All you have to do is go instead of me. We don't resemble each other enough, otherwise I'd gladly go, said the hyena rather sadly. Listen, I said. No one sees too well in the evening light. Besides, we're practically the same size. You're my only friend. I beg you to do this for me. She thought this over, and I knew that she really wanted to accept. Done, she said, all of a sudden. At home, everybody was still in bed. In my room, I brought out the dress I was to wear that evening. It was a little long, and the hyena found it difficult to walk in my high-heeled shoes. I found some gloves to hide her hands, which were too hairy to look like mine. By the time the sun was shining into my room, she was able to make her way around the room, walking more or less upright. We were so busy that my mother almost opened the door to say good morning before the hyena had hidden under my bed. There's a bad smell in your room, my mother said, opening the window. You must have a scented bath before tonight with my new bath salts. Certainly, I said. She didn't stay long. I think the smell was too much for her. Don't be late for breakfast, she said, and left the room. The greatest difficulty was to find a way of disguising the hyena's face. We spent hours and hours looking for a way, but she always rejected my suggestions. At last she said, I think I found the answer. Have you got a maid? Yes, I said, puzzled. There you are then. Ring for your maid, and when she comes in, we'll pounce upon her and tear off her face. I'll wear her face tonight instead of mine. It's not practical, I said. She'll probably die if she hasn't got a face. Somebody will certainly find the corpse and will be put in prison. I'm hungry enough to eat her, the hyena replied. And the bones? As well, she said. So it's on. Only if you promise to kill her before tearing off her face. It'll hurt too much otherwise. All right, it's all the same to me. Not without a certain amount of nervousness, I rang for Mary, my maid. I certainly wouldn't have done it if I didn't hate having to go to a ball so much. When Mary came in, I turned to the wall so as not to see. I must admit, it didn't take long. A brief cry and it was over. While the hyena was eating, I looked out the window. A few minutes later, she said, I can't eat anymore. Her 2 feet are left over still, but if you have a little bag, I'll eat them later in the day. In front of the mirror, the hyena was admiring herself in Mary's face. She had nibbled very neatly around the face so that what was left was exactly what was needed. You've certainly done that well, I said. Towards evening, when the hyena was all dressed up, she declared, I really feel in tip-top form. I have a feeling that I shall be a great success this evening. When we heard the music from downstairs for quite some time, I said to her, go on down now, and remember, don't stand next to my mother. I kissed her as I left her, but she did smell very strong. Night fell, tired by the day's emotions. I took a book and sat down by the open window, giving myself up to peace and quiet. About an hour later, I noticed the first signs of trouble. A bat flew in at the window, uttering little cries. I am terribly afraid of bats. I hid behind a chair, my teeth chattering. I had hardly gone down on my knees when the sound of beating wings was overcome by a great noise at my door. My mother entered, pale with rage. We just sat down at the table, she said, when that thing sitting in your place got up and shouted, so I smell a bit strong. What? Well, I don't eat cakes. Whereupon it tore off its face and ate it. And with one great bound, it disappeared through the window.
Yay. I love that story so much. Thank you. I actually had completely forgotten about that little bat that comes in there.
Yeah, yeah.
And in fact, I was not going to ask you about the erotic. I was going to ask you about animals because I knew you were the debutante, and it's such a good animal story of hers. I mean, most of her stories are pretty good animal stories, but your own fiction, Kathryn, has so many good animals in it too. I mean, lots of dogs, and then you have a wolf in your room right now. I saw him before.
Left.
Yeah. She was tired of us. And then I'm particularly fond of your beavers in The Thin Place. And so I just sort of, and actually I also once read an interview with you where you talked about having had like a dream encounter with a horse who gave you very solid writing advice that you took.
That was Mr. Ed. That was Mr. Ed, the talking horse from television.
Do you want to tell me because it's very Carrington-esque, that story.
It was when I thought I was writing my first novel, which turned out not to be my first novel, because as I was writing it, I had this secret suspicion that it was not a very good book, but because it's hard to know when you don't really know what you're doing the first time around. Should I work harder, or should I say enough is enough? And then one night I had a dream, and in the dream, Mr. Ed, the talking horse, I went out to the barn, and I did at that time have a barn that had a real horse in it, but in the dream, it was Mr. Ed's head came out of that little window that horses' heads come out of. And he looked at me and he said, "It's boring," which was the way Mr. Ed talked.
Right.
And I knew that I was going to put that book aside forever.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I mean, it was really good advice from a dreamcore.
it was excellent advice.
Yeah. And it is very hard to know that when you're working on something for a long time. So I just wanted to ask you, start with you, and then hear what Chloe and Merve think too about Carrington's animals, her relationship to non-human animals throughout her work, the visual art and in the writing, if you have, thoughts about her animals.
Well, I think that what is really striking in the Hearing Trumpet, again, in terms of the way, oh, here's Lucy. Can you see her?
Mm-hmm.
Is she a real wolf? Is she really a wolf?
She's a Malamute.
Oh man.
She's like all the dogs that get born at the end of the Hearing Trumpet. The fluffy white puppies. I think that what struck me was how essentially that book ends. It's a kind of apocalyptic novel, unlike any other apocalyptic novel that all these people are writing apocalyptic novel upon apocalyptic novel, and I have to say many of them are beginning to seem kind of boring and the same. Mm-hmm. And the thing about the Hearing Trumpet is it is unlike any other apocalyptic novel you're likely to read these days. And in fact, this is slightly off the subject of the animals, but in terms of what she is visualizing, astonishingly, when she wrote the book, it is so apt in terms of all of the sorts of things we might be fearful about seeing happen right now. Mm-hmm. And the happy ending of the book, it rests in the hands of a few very, very old women. Mm-hmm. Yay. And animals. The animals basically are being granted the right to take over everything. It's even stated there at the end. I won't try to find the passage, but it's like, thank goodness we're leaving this world in the hands or paws of the animals. Mm-hmm. And the animals are also a kind of constant presence in this book, in many of her stories. And they are, I think, really also like Leonora, although they're animals, so she understands she's not an animal, but there's some very non-judgmental quality. There's no moral superiority being expressed, which I feel like right now, I've just had it up to here with moral superiority. And this world and her vision and the animals in particular partake of an inability to express moral superiority. That's not what they're about. They just do what they do.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Any responses?
Yeah. Well, what you're saying between us, or
yeah. Well, mm-hmm.
Yes, and I think just to add to what Kathryn was saying, with animals, which throughout her life and her work have such an important presence, and her identification with the animal kingdom, starting with the horses of her childhood, then cats, of course, very important. They almost seem like they possess some secret knowledge. They're oracular presences in a lot of her paintings, and also Leonora was one of the most authentic artists. She didn't give a damn what other people thought, and it's something about animals that they just exist. They're not worried about. It's not they're governed by instinct. They're not constructed selves. There's no self-fashioning, and they were just free of any kind of, they're free of any kind of self-consciousness, or and so I think, and also in her short stories, so many of them are inhabited by either animals or the most sympathetic humans in her short stories. Almost all have feral spirit and are more at one in the forest at night and sorrow and destruction occurs the moment humans enter almost any landscape, hunters or processions, royal processions.
I mean, you can't know what animals are about, right? They are completely unknowable. And I think what's interesting is like, how do you coexist with something that you can't know? And in order to coexist with something that you don't know, what kinds of assumptions about what it means to exist you need to kind of get rid of, right? There's no reason, I mean, Kathryn, you were talking about moral pronouncements, but there's also no reason that any kind of human morality or human knowledge needs to be what we measure a liberated or pleasurable existence by. And I think that's what's wonderful about the animals in her fiction, is that they're always reminding you both of the inaccessibility of a great deal of the world through something like rational human thought, and that there have to be other ways to coexist with the creatures in the world that don't prioritize what we as humans are adept at doing.
I feel like coming off of what all the three of you just said, I feel like what I'm about to say seems like a really stupid question, but I keep wondering about it, so it must not be that stupid. But do you feel like are animals political in her work, or is that not it exactly? Because each of you seems to kind of touch on a way in which you could read them as political, but does it, or is it not rationalized in that way, do you think?
Oh, I think it's quite explicitly political. I mean, if you look at the end of the Hearing Trumpet, to make the kind of utopian possibility of the future, the idea that the animals would populate the world, I mean, that there couldn't be a more political statement than that.
Yeah, and I can't find it now, Merve, but I'm thinking about in your article you have something about this idea that humans, which I feel like is specifically women or old women, like the humans and the hyenas are going to like band together to sort of fight against the machine of empire and capitalism, you know, like that's chewing up the planet, that this is the kind of like, that her ecofeminism is like maybe sort of quite centered on non-human animals in a way. Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, I think Kathryn is absolutely right that it resonates with many of the anxieties we're feeling now, but it's also, I think, very solidly a Cold War novel.
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons I find her work fascinating is because it is a total precursor to the kinds of, to the ways of thinking about, say, the post-human that arose out of precisely that same moment, which was how do we find ways to band together to react to the militarized state, to these men with their giant weapons, which they bandy about like playthings. And what's extraordinary to me is that she was making that argument in the form of the novel about 20 years before that argument was being made in, say, critical theory.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Kathryn.
I think that is true about the way in which the animals are used, say, politically. But I also do feel like the animals so her stories, her novels, they're very surreal, and human life is presented in a way that is it's the vision of it is surreal as opposed to realistic. But the animals are always just the animals. The animals are they have like a smell, like they have an animal smell. They're real animals. I mean, and I think that's part of what makes it so powerful when you read the use she puts them to, is that they have a kind of heft to them in the world of her fiction that a lot of other things do not have, because they have smells and they have bones and they have like appetites. And I find that really exhilarating.
And
Oh,
Chloe,
Oh, sorry. Okay.
I was gonna even say something to you, so go ahead.
No. I was just building a bit on that. I think one of the most important concepts when thinking about Leonora's work is, of course, hybridity, and which is also sort of the existence of the emigre, which she was, and then most of her social circle, and that sense of not ever being one thing or another, and this hybridity not only of whether it was female, human animals or animal composites, bizarre crossbreeds of a whole bestiary that she created. But I think it's also very much this indeterminacy of being that she very much, and the freedom granted by it. And I think for her, animals were so important that, I don't know, my gut feeling was that she wouldn't, maybe subconscious, maybe somewhere deep down she was politicizing it, but I think instinctually they were just there coexisting with her at almost every moment of her life, and just somehow emerging from.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go on.
Does she remind you of Cavendish?
Does she remind me of Margaret Cavendish? Yeah, I mean, I loved seeing that in your article. Yeah, I can absolutely see that, like Cavendish's Bearman, but Cavendish uses animals in a different way, like totally different from what Kathryn's talking about. Her animals are just people stand-ins, made sort of fantastical. And I agree with Kathryn, what Kathryn was saying, that like these animals feel like animals, like they're stinky, and they're vicious without that being mean at all, because they're just they're non-human animals. And then, but so what Chloe was talking about, this hybridity of Carrington's work, I want us to be sure we talk a little bit about the paintings, like pull them in. Carrington seems to exist to me totally as a writer, but also totally as a visual artist. And I think that's quite unusual. Like I know poets who make, collages, or painters who write really bad poems. I think it's unusual to find someone who so completely exists as an artist in both. And so you even said female, human, and animal, like when you were talking just a minute ago, Chloe. So I wonder if you could say something about both curating that retrospective of Carrington's paintings, but also about the film Female, Human, Animal that you were in, that I read was, I'm dying to see it, and I don't know how yet, maybe you can tell us, which I read was like a documentary thriller, which is quite interesting. And I know it takes its name from an essay Carrington wrote. And so, yeah, could you just talk about all three of those things in some form?
Well, yes, I guess, why I'm here today probably is we met, my family and I, we met Carrington in the early 90s and had a friendship with her the last 20 years of our lives here in Mexico, 20 years of her life rather. And we had the same doctor and dentist, wonderful doctor named Dr. Teodoro Cesarman, and then still our dentist, Isaac Masri, who's helped a lot make the sculptures and works with the foundry. And they were artists, they were dentists and doctors to all the artists and writers in Mexico. So we met her that way, but oh yes. And so 2015, there was a big show of hers. I wouldn't really say retrospective because it was quite selective and we could have had much more work, and we had it at Tate Liverpool. So I co-curated it with Francesco Manacorda, with the curator at Tate Liverpool. And it was called Transgressing Discipline, and precisely that, the way she moved between genres and mediums. And we got that magnificent cradle that she painted for Kathy Orna. It was the first time leaving Mexico, and then her mural of the magical world of the Mayas, which also was the first time it left Mexico, that lives here in the Museum of Anthropology. But we wanted very much to let the whole narrative of the exhibition was structured around her voice, and just instead of having captions, we just had quotes of hers on the wall, and we sort of tried to think of it as a seance, sort of resurrecting her spirit. And so when I was working on it, my friend, one of my best friends named Joshua Piñanesi, who sort of grew up in a house of psychoanalysis, he's a filmmaker, he said, oh, would you mind if I start filming you hanging the show. So I said, well, sure. And he said, well, I've had a few ideas for a story, and he began scripting it. And I'm not an actress by any means. And but the interesting thing, one of the brilliant approaches that Josh took was that it seems like verite, but he actually scripted even most of the documentary bits. So even when I'm speaking, even in interviews, a lot of it is, or a voiceover, it's Josh's voice. And he found really remarkable footage of Leonora speaking, often before I knew her in the 60s or 70s, and he cut with it. So it looked like a dialogue between generations, between women of generations. So just returning to the Hearing Trumpet, it's been fascinating because it's a book she wrote before she reached old age, which is, I guess when I knew her old age, but envisioning the old age, but didn't see so much of the self of the person I knew already when she was envisioning it and projecting into the future. Oh yes, and so the title is based on an essay she wrote, I think it's 1970. And again, just saying how I'm a female, human, and animal. Beyond that, just a rejection of labels and sort of any sort of patriarchal structure. And throughout, Leonora has this very spectral presence, almost like a Greek chorus that sort of drifts in and comments on the action on my character's inner life and then drifts out again. Yeah, so it's sort of a hybrid of sorts too.
Mm-hmm.
It's strange. So when she was alive, of course, she was such an important person in my life, but sort of posthumously, she sort of keeps entering my life in strange ways that I never expected.
First of all, I'm fascinated that like all the artists in Mexico have the same dentist. I'm really stuck on that right now. Can you say anything about the essay, Carrington's essay, Female, Human, Animal, and how the film got that name?
Well, Josh originally wanted to call it Giantess, and I said, "There's no way I'm going to appear in a film called Giantess."
After the painting.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
which also I think also seems we could also speak about that in relation to the Hearing Trumpet and Robert Graves. No, we were thinking about titles, and Josh wanted very much to have a title that came from her work. So then I remember this essay. I said, Josh, I have the title, and also because my beloved cat is in the film. So even though, so the animal spirit is there in him too, in Ludwig, my gray cat, who appears much more menacing in the film than in real life. But and then we got an actor I knew from Berlin, was in the Volksbühne, named Mark Hosemann, who's just very visceral, and sort of Klaus Kinski does the whole range between grotesque and sinister, and so elements from real life, but sort of, defamiliarized.
People are asking in the chat how they can see this film, which is called Female, Human, Animal, because people are asking. Can you answer that question?
I know in England it's on BFI Player and Amazon, but in the US I have no idea. But,
okay.
It's on Amazon Prime in the US.
Thank you. Actually, Chloe, could you read Kathryn, did you have a question?
Did you say that Klaus Kinski is in the movie?
No, a German actor who reminds me, sort of the modern day equivalent of Klaus Kinski.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, no, because we made the film, well, we filmed intermittently, but we began filming in 2015, so.
Yeah, I thought that didn't make sense, but I just wondered.
Yeah.
Chloe, do you want to read for us, tell us what you were going to read and read that from that for us? And actually, what if we did a slideshow of some of pictures of Carrington and her artwork while you're reading that? Would that be okay?
Sure.
Okay.
So I just wanted to preface maybe one of the images which will probably be much less familiar to most of you, which is Pig Rush, which is an oil painting she did from 1960 of a pack of wild swine that seemed to be accosting three bearded figures with top hats. And for many years, we didn't know the origin of this painting. And then my mother came across in The White Goddess, a passage that said these were actually the swineherds dressed as magicians, and the the large white sow who's leading the wild pigs was a shape-shifting goddess, Celtic shape-shifting goddess called Ceridwen. And so anyway, so that was exciting to see one of the most direct visual references to the white goddess in her work.
Okay, great.
It appears.
Okay, cool. So Hal, go ahead, and then Chloe, you can read and tell us what you're reading. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, yeah, there's the magical room. Also, I'm just going to read. So we would often go on Sundays for tea to her house. So over the years, just everything she said was so remarkable that I sometimes I'd often write it down afterwards just so I wouldn't forget it. So years later on the 100th anniversary, which she would have turned 100 on April 6, 2017, I published this A to Z of memories of Leonora's. So I'll just read it. And I guess for those of you who've read The Hearing Trumpet, there'll be many things that somehow resonate a lot with Marian Leatherby's character, I think. So A, ambidextrous. Leonora could write and paint with both hands at once, forwards and backwards. Yes, I'm ambidextrous, like madmen, she once said. B, bullfighting. These are mostly quotes from her. Horrific. It's a disgusting, shameful demonstration of human stupidity and cruelty. I was once put out at a bullfight. I got up and clapped when the bull jumped over the ring and chased all the attendants around. And I just clapped and clapped and they put me out. C, cats. The last cats Leonora owned were Ramona and Monsieur, two green-eyed Siamese who followed her around the house. She wanted a dog too, but worried the cats would stop talking to her. D, devils. I think they're very dangerous devils, and I think they're interesting devils, and I think they're very stupid devils. I think they're probably intelligent ones, and angels and anything that has been invented. Hundreds, thousands of them, all over the place. Well, I use the word invented when I really mean seen. I don't know what invented means, really, do you? E, England. Leonora would express nostalgia for England, but at the same time, no desire to return. She missed the trees and the architecture rather than the people, since most of those she knew had died, and the eventful moments of her life had taken place abroad. F, filters. Until her final days, Leonora smoked. Her choice of cigarette varied, but she always attached them to short plastic filters, which she would clean and reuse. G, gray. More than anything, Leonora wore gray. Baggy gray trousers, long gray sweaters, gray shawls, gray turtlenecks, gray lace-up shoes. Occasionally she'd bring in some purple, but my memory of her is distinctly in gray. H, haunting. Leonora would sometimes mention a middle-aged woman in pink who would appear in different rooms of her house. A few friends claimed to see the ghost too, standing behind her. She was never scared, however. As she said in previous times, her home had been a printing house, which is not very sinister. I, imagination. Nothing is created by the imagination. Imagination is a very mysterious force, which we know very little about. We don't know if it creates anything. I think that things occur. Like, for instance, someone must have once invented a cup because it was easier than putting your face into a river and lapping up the water. That was J, Edward James. Englishman in Mexico, patron of the surrealists. Leonora was very fond of him, despite saying he lacked respect for his friends and would wash his hands with her shampoo. K, the Kabbalah, the book Leonora would mention most often, important to her throughout her lifetime. L, Lapland. Once when we'd ask Leonora what place she would most like to visit, she replied, Lapland. She loved reindeer and wished the Laps would stop eating them. M, manipulation. She described manipulation. No, she once said manipulation is what makes the great cosmic yogurt. And Nagas, some of Leonora's favorite mythical creatures from Indian mythology, which featured in her paintings and sculptures. O, orange pekoe. Leonora would often ask me to bring her a tin of tea from England, especially orange pekoe. She also loved PG Tips, which she called bog standard English tea, and said she much preferred it to fancy teas. Whatever I brought her, she would keep under lock and key so that no one else could use it. Cacher la boîte, the PG Tips, I should say. P, painting. I rarely paint images from dreams. Images occur just like that. They occur from something that is further away from my consciousness, I think. But any painter would tell you that. Q, quel désir d'extravagance. André Breton's first words on seeing her paintings in Paris when Leonora was 20. R, Roma. Colonia Roma was the neighborhood of Mexico City she lived in from the 1940s. Over the decades, it underwent an enormous transformation. Across the street lay the debris of a collapsed building, a victim of the earthquake of 1985, which housed a growing community of cats and homeless people. Leonora called it a garden of scorpions. S, spiritualism. Leonora could see through the hocus pocus of people who claimed to have supernatural powers. She once played a trick on what she called a very serious ex-Nazi with a thick German accent who held a seance. She brought along one of her sons, and before the session, they attached a small instrument to the bottom of the table. It made metallic noises whenever it was pulled by a string. Everyone sat down. After a while, Leonora began to grow bored. She or her son pulled the string. Noises were heard coming from beneath the table. I think there's someone there, Leonora said. Who are you, said the ex-Nazi. I think it's a horse, Leonora said. The man stood up and tipped the table over to reveal the hidden instrument. He was livid and never spoke to Leonora again. T, time. I don't need to kill time. It's killing me. That was her reply when we asked whether she played chess, and she said she wasn't interested in board games and would rather draw. U, University of Contraception. Leonora would often complain there were too many people in the world and wish they would establish such a university. V, Remedios Varo. Feline-faced Spanish painter, one of Leonora's closest female friends with whom she shared a love of cats. W, Americo Weiss, also known as Cheeky, Hungarian photographer to whom Leonora was married for over 50 years, with whom she always spoke French till the very end. X, Xanax, Tafil in Mexico. Leonora would often take half a tablet every night to sleep. Y, Yeti, Leonora's last pet after Ramona and Monsieur, a small white hyperactive Maltese, which her dentist gave her. Z, Zoology. Leonora adored animals, mythical and real. I draw completely from my mind. Well, I don't know if it's my mind, but if I'm drawing an animal like a cat, I'd like to draw it from real life. So that's, oh yeah, there's Yeti. So that's this photograph on the right. It's the last picture my father took of her in March 2011, so 1 month before she died. And there's Yeti staring up. There was a plate of cookies right there on the table, so Yeti was staring at it. But, and that's, I think from '94, one of her bronze sculpture ovens called Ing, like cooking, doing, making. There's a little, yeah. Oh, and that's, oh yes, you can go to the next one. Yes, and that's a picture I took once in her kitchen, and I just love all the shadows of all the utensils that look like they were about to come to life, and again just the fantastic and the domestic in the same space. That's without even trying to, Leonora would create it. Yeah.
Thank you, Chloe. That was wonderful. I can see that the chat is filling up with questions, so I'm gonna move us over to that in just a second. One of the questions is actually about like the publication history and how Dorothy came about this book. And so just to answer that very quickly, it actually came about because we loved, and in particular my partner Marty, the Hearing Trumpet so much, and wondered what was going on with it, and started looking into what, like, its publication status. And that's how we got in touch with Paul DeAngelis. And it just turned out that they had this collection. I mean, it was so lucky, like dumb luck of us. We sort of just like stumbled into the possibility of publishing these stories. And you know, the first time all the stories had been collected together, and there were a few that were previously unpublished. And those appear in the back of this book. They are The Sand Camel, Mr. Gregory's Fly, and Jemima and the Wolf. And I was going to read just very quickly Mr. Gregory's Fly. It's only 2 pages long, and it's really, really good. And then I wanted to share a tiny bit of the typescript of the story with you all. So Mr. Gregory's Fly. Once there was a man with a big black mustache. His name was Mr. Gregory. The man and the mustache had the same name. Since his youth, Mr. Gregory was bothered by a fly that used to enter his mouth when he spoke, and when somebody spoke to him, the fly would fly out of his ear. This fly annoys me," said Mr. Gregory to his wife, and she answered, "I understand, and it looks ugly. You ought to consult a doctor." However, no doctor was able to cure Mr. Gregory of his fly. Although he went to see several doctors, they always said that they had never heard of this disease. One day, Mr. Gregory went to see another doctor, but he got the wrong address and by mistake went to see a midwife. She was a wise woman and she knew a lot of things besides childbirthing. "Ah, that fly, I know about that," said the wise woman when Mr. Gregory said, "Pardon, I thought I was going to see Dr. Fontaine," and the fly, as usual, flew into his mouth. "Me, I know how to cure your fly," said the wise woman. "Enchanted, madam," answered Mr. Gregory. So the wise woman offered him a chair, saying, "Yes, I know how to cure the fly, but it's going to be expensive, like 3/4 of your wealth." Mr. Gregory jumped a bit. Then he said, "All right." He wrote the following letter: "I give my house to the wise woman." The house was not his. "I give my wife," he wanted to get rid of her anyway, 10 shillings, he didn't have them, "and a cow." This, in fact, was a ferocious bull. George Lawrence Gregory. This was his real name. The wise woman knew quite well that Mr. Gregory was telling lies in the letter, but she didn't say anything. She just took the letter and spat on the ground. Then she gave some pills to Mr. Gregory and she said, "Take 2 after every meal and a tea made of little drops of mustard in noodle water. That's it." "Thank you very much," said Mr. Gregory. I'm sorry, the word noodle makes me laugh. And he left content. Later, Mr. Gregory took the pills in a tea made of little drops of mustard in noodle water, according to the instructions of the wise woman. The next day, the fly had totally disappeared, but Mr. Gregory had become navy blue with red zip fasteners over his orifices. "It's worse than the fly," said his wife. But Mr. Gregory didn't say much because he knew that he had cheated the wise woman. "I deserved it," he thought. "If only I had that little fly again, I'd be happy." But he was still navy blue and with red zip fasteners and stayed like that till the end of his days. And this was very ugly, especially when he was naked in his bath. So it's just a very good story. And we got this typewritten manuscript of the stories with her handwriting all over it. I assume it's her handwriting. It looks like her handwriting. And we had to decipher these, and that was very exciting and challenging. And then the thing I wanted to share was that at the very end, there's this wonderful list. And I don't know what it means, but I want to read it to you. I can't read every word, but it says 4, the fat bat to come. 5, the cake of lies to come. 6, the tasseled teeth to come. 7, something something skin to come. 8, the policeman and the pork chop to come. 9, the ogre something to come. And then 10, I think it says centaur, but I'm not 100% sure. So that's all I was going to say about publishing Carrington, and I'm going to move over here and ask some questions over from the audience. So let me see. Some of these things I think we maybe have already addressed. One thing, Stephen Sparks, bookseller extraordinaire, says, "I'm grateful to the publishers who have made Carrington's work available again, and I wonder if any of you have a sense as to why this feels like such an appropriate moment for a rediscovery of her writing." Merve, I saw you nodding.
Oh, I mean, it's like the last year has probably made it really apparent to all of us that we have not been as responsible as we ought to be to the non-human world. And there's very much a way, I think, to trace everything that has happened over the past year to that irresponsibility and the carelessness of human beings toward non-human world. And so to me, I mean, reading the novels and reading short stories over the past couple of months, I think truly like rewired my brain and the way that I think about interacting with what we think of as nature. And so to me, this feels like a particularly rich moment for all of the horrors that she's on the one hand learning about, and on the other offering what I think, like, for all the absurdity of the stories, there are moments where you just see like what feels to me like really practical solutions. And one of the things I love about the end of the Hearing Trumpet is the imagination of a world in which like there is no like air travel possible anymore, and the postman that arrives has to like I think walk maybe or sleigh. I can't remember exactly what his mode of transportation is from London to where the women are. And so thinking about the way that these novels comment on things that are as basic to us as like infrastructure, right? And the way that our infrastructures of living have imposed on a world that is now, I think, imposing back. You know, what I can't think of anything else we should be thinking about right now. And to me, that's so much more important than, you know, presidential elections or transitions or whatever. Like that is the largest frame for the crisis that we're living through right now.
Oh, I totally agree. Yeah. And in reading this book, again, just this past week, that I was so struck by this little passage on page 157. It is impossible to understand how millions and millions of people all obey a sickly government of gentlemen that call themselves, a sickly collection of gentlemen that all call themselves government. The word I expect frightens people. It is a form of planetary hypnosis and very unhealthy. And it did feel like the book was freakishly speaking to this exact moment that we're living through. Kathryn, did you want to say something?
Oh, I would only just reiterate the fact that the tone of it also is not, it's not a hectoring tone, which seems to me to be precisely what we need to be hearing.
Do you see any anonymous attendee, any connections between the hybridity of Carrington's conception as described by Merve and the surrealist exquisite corpse game? Does her playfulness make the absurdity of life more palatable? Anyone? I don't really, yeah, yes. I know what the exquisite corpse game is, but I don't know the like theory behind it, other than just making life more palatable, which parlor games always do. Okay, Eileen Giselle, one thing I find refreshing about her female narratives is how candidly they eschew traditional feminine virtue, and yet so many, like Kathryn said, are open-hearted and tender at times. To what extent do you think that she was influenced by feminist consciousness in her time? Chloe, do you know?
Can you, I was looking, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, well, basically the question is, to what extent was Carrington influenced by feminist consciousness in her? Was she like, I mean, I know she worked for women's liberation organizations in Mexico, but do you know if, I mean, I just imagine she thought of herself as a feminist, but do you know if she was, I mean, what?
She definitely embraced, again, I think she always shunned labels, but I think she would definitely, yeah, if someone asked her, you're a feminist or do you align yourself, she would have said yes. And it was just with the, well, Merve, you've done more research recently probably on this.
Well, Paul just said in the chat that yes, she did say she was a feminist, okay. but I would just add that, like, you know, she is, to my mind, like the supreme feminist. I mean, like a feminist who is really interested in questions of care and collectivity. And that to me seems like it almost doesn't matter whether she claims it or not. Like that just is a model of feminist world making, right? And
part of what, you know, she described the white goddess as the greatest revelation of her life. And it was Robert Graves saying how the first social order was the matriarchy. And with the for her giantess, where it was synonymous with goddess. And well, we haven't even mentioned the word Abbess yet in I think our conversation, but the whole figure of the Abbess in the novel, and as women as repositories of knowledge and wisdom, and the only ones who can maybe set things right.
But she seemed very resistant to category. I thought it was interesting, Chloe, when you were reading and we were looking at the pictures, how she insisted that the images that she painted, you know, didn't come to her in dreams, which would sort of be like the standard surrealist explanation. I mean, they were a kind of inevitability, and there's a way she approached life, it seems to me, that, I mean, I'm sure if somebody said, "Are you a feminist?" she would agree with that categorization, but that isn't, she was just what she was.
Exactly.
And if that happened to embrace things that we would describe as feminism, you know, so be it. But I think that's what's just so thrilling to me about a person like her, because there aren't a lot of them. Well, there was just one like her, so.
Sorry, just one more. So Paul just said in the chat that she was also an extremely proud mother of her boys. And that just reminded me that I wanted to mention one other book, which is The Milk of Dreams, which is her book of ostensibly children's stories. And if anybody watching does have young children, I have a 4-year-old and a 3-year-old, and they absolutely adore this book, and that's also available from the New York Review of Books, but it is our favorite bedtime reading, and wonderfully, I think, funny, and also quite certainly not didactic, but educational in all of the ways that we've been talking about.
Senior mustache is we're big fans in our house of the senior. I want to apologize because there are still so many questions in the Q&A, and I feel like we're running out of time. And I'm sure people need to go to sleep or make dinner or wherever people are on the planet right now. But there's a great question about the relationship between Marian and Carmela in the book, and how female friendship is working in Carrington's work as a whole. I just want to acknowledge that excellent question. There's also a wonderful question about how doesn't Carrington's work in life push back against the sort of cliche about the women of surrealism being simply muses or sort of passive receptacles. So excellent questions. I want to say one last question of my own, which is that reading this book made me think about one of my other favorite books, which is also an NYRB Classics book, which is Lolly Willows, or The Loving Huntsman by Sylvia Townsend Warner, in which the dependable Aunt Lolly, spinster Aunt Lolly, just says fuck this to her family in London, and she moves to the country and becomes a Satan worshiper. And she really winds up being such a wonderfully almost dashing old lady heroine. And I was thinking about Marian, and I was thinking about Lolly, and I wanted to ask the three of you if you can think of other books with just really great old lady protagonists as a way of ending.
Well, of course, the Olga Tokarczuk, which I know is later. I did, now that I have reread The Hearing Trumpet and then read her excellent Afterword, I realized how the spirit had been so infused with her character in Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead. And also the anti-hunting message, of course, and just the respect for nature and wild animals, and again feeling much more, identifying this old lady much more, identifying much more with the animals in the wood than the other humans in the book, except for her friend who translates Blake. And
yeah, great, excellent, thank you. Anyone else? No other, because I think it's kind of hard to think of them.
Well,
yeah.
It's embarrassing to say this, but I would say that my second novel was about a really powerful old woman. So
that's not embarrassing.
What's it called?
The Girl Who Trod on a Loaf, which is based on a Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale, and it's about an old woman who's an opera composer. So.
Muriel Sparks, Memento Mori. I don't know if it's a great old woman, but in general, also I just reviewed earlier this year Sigrid Nunez's new book, the name of which I'm really embarrassingly forgetting right now.
What are you going through?
What are you going through? Yes, thank you. What are you going through? And that I think is an excellent novel. And it's also quite attuned to the fact that the novel as a form is generally a young person's genre. That you have the Bildungsroman, on the one hand, you have like maybe the midlife crisis novel, but generally you don't see the novel engaging with people who are in their 80s, their 90s, their 100s. And I think that one of the things that's so wonderful about the Hearing Trumpet is that it shows what it might look like to reclaim life, or to claim life for yourself at a moment when everybody else refuses to give it to you, or to let you have it, and how to use the novel as a form to do precisely that.
That seems like an amazing and great note to end on. Thank you so much, all of you, for participating in all of your insights and delightfulness. And Hal, thanks.
I'm back. I just am entering so stressed out because it's January and this is probably going to be our best event of the year. So thank you guys. Thank you, Danielle, Merve, Kathryn, and Chloe for your time tonight and for exploring what a wonderful body of work and an amazing slideshow. Thank you so much for NYRB for putting that together for us. Thank you, Chloe, for sharing your pictures with us. Hearing that underneath your reading was really special, I thought. Just as a reminder to everybody, the book that we were sort of arranging the discussion around tonight is available from the bookstore along with the rest of Carrington's work. And otherwise, wow, yeah, I'm gonna go make dinner and just feel great. Everybody be well, be safe, wherever you are. We'll see you soon, hopefully.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
It was great meeting everybody. It was
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
Good night.